Okay, so that BIO259 lecture
Yeah.
on reflexes with Dr. Rosario
Oh my gosh.
was intense.
I know.
My biggest takeaway, I had no idea how much was going on
Right.
beneath the surface, literally with all these automatic responses happening all the time.
It's like our bodies are on autopilot for so much. And it's even crazier is that there are actually two totally different types of reflexes,
Oh, yeah.
intrinsic and acquired.
Hmm.
Did you know that before the lecture?
Honestly, I didn't. I thought a reflex was just a reflex.
Yeah.
But when Dr. Rosario showed that video of BTS flinching,
Oh my God,
when
yes.
that fruit came flying at them,
Yes.
it all clicked.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so for those of us who don't remember the BTS example, can you explain to us what a flinch reflex is?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, great question.
So, a flinch is that super quick reaction.
Like an automatic response.
Exactly, like when something unexpected comes at you.
Right. And Dr. Rosario showed us this great video
Yeah, with the K-pop band BTS.
where a piece of fruit flew towards their face.
Even though they were behind glass, they all reacted.
Yeah, they ducked, they closed their eyes.
Some even put their hands up in front of them.
It's all an attempt to protect themselves.
And the key thing here is that it's all automatic.
Exactly. You don't have to think about it, you just react.
It's like a survival mechanism.
Yeah, and like that's a good point calling it a survival mechanism. Can you think of reasons why reflexes would have evolved in humans?
That's a fantastic question. And yeah, it really highlights why these things are so important.
What's fascinating here is how these reflexes have given us a survival advantage.
Exactly. Like Dr. Rosario mentioned, they protect vital areas.
Yeah, our eyes and our faces are super vulnerable.
Think about dodging something flying at your face.
If we had to think about that, we'd be way too slow.
We wouldn't be able to react in time.
We'd get hurt.
Yeah, like if we were out hunting or gathering,
Right, dodging a falling branch or something.
we need to react faster than we can think.
Absolutely. These reflexes have helped us survive for millennia.
So that's a good description for these intrinsic reflexes that are really related to our survival as a species. But what about acquired reflexes? What do you know about acquired reflexes?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something we should dig into.
Yeah, it's really interesting how our bodies can learn and adapt over time.
Right. So, unlike the flinch, which is like this hardwired thing,
Acquired reflexes involve a learning process.
like how Kobe Bryant could train himself not to flinch.
Exactly, consciously overriding the instinct.
It's like rewiring your nervous system.
Yeah, through practice and repetition,
Dr. Rosario also called it motor learning,
where complex movements become almost automatic over time.
like learning how to drive a stick shift.
Yes, remember when you first started?
Oh my gosh, it was a nightmare.
Stalling out all the time?
Yeah, but now it's just muscle memory.
Sometimes these acquired reflexes can backfire, though.
Oh, totally. Like the cereal bowl example.
Yes, like throwing the bowl instead of the milk carton.
I do that all the time.
It's like our brain, the autopilot, picks the wrong program.
Yeah, but that's kind of how reflexes work, right?
So now that we've covered the different kinds, let's talk about how they work.
Okay, like the actual mechanism.
Yeah, Dr. Rosario mentioned the 5 parts of a reflex arc.
Receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector.
So those are definitely the major components of a reflex arc. But one of the new things you might have learned in this class actually has to do with a muscle spindle, which is really important for sensory information. Can we talk about muscle spindles a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. That's a fantastic point.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how these tiny sensors in our muscles work.
It's like this whole hidden world within our muscles, right?
Exactly. Dr. Rosario said that muscle spindles are essential.
They're like the body's internal length monitors,
Yeah, and they're a big part of the stretch reflex.
which, as we were just about to get into, is a monosynaptic reflex.
Right, and it's all tied to how our muscles sense their environment.
Okay, so before we dodge too deep into the details of the reflex arc, let's talk more about these spindles.
Yeah, let's really unpack these muscle spindles first.
Okay, so they're these specialized structures embedded within our muscles, right?
Yes, they're like little sensors that detect how much a muscle is stretched.
And they contain intrafusal fibers,
Right, and those are the key players.
unlike the extrafusal fibers that make the muscle contract.
Yes, the intrafusal fibers are modified to be non-contractile.
Okay, so they don't help with muscle force.
Their job is just to monitor the length and tension of the muscle.
So they're like tiny measuring tapes inside your muscles.
Exactly, and they're wrapped with sensory neurons.
So that sends information to the spinal cord.
Exactly, and this info is critical for that stretch reflex.
Right, where a muscle contracts to prevent overstretching.
And that's all thanks to the muscle spindles sensing how much it's being stretched.
Okay, so they're like the key to the whole feedback loop.
Yes, and they're crucial for the knee-jerk reflex as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely dive into that later on.
All right, so before we go into any specific reflexes, I just want to ask you, what do you think is maybe the most confusing thing about muscle spindles for a college student?
That's a really insightful question, actually.
Yeah, it's good to think about where students might get tripped up.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think it's that whole idea of intrafusal fibers.
Yeah, that they're non-contractile is definitely counterintuitive.
Exactly. I mean, we've spent all this time talking about how muscle fibers contract,
Right, and suddenly there are these fibers that don't.
and they're inside the muscle spindle. So it's like, what are they doing?
Yeah, and it's hard to wrap your head around them not contributing to force.
Yeah, I think you've identified one of the most confusing things, right? Intrafusal, intra means within, fusal means spindle. So these are muscle fibers within the spindle, and yeah, they don't contribute to muscle force at all. They're really just there to help with the sensation of how long a muscle is being stretched or how quickly a muscle is being stretched. All right, with that information, let's jump into talking about the stretch reflex itself. What do you know about the stretch reflex?
Okay, so the stretch reflex, first and foremost, is monosynaptic.
Right? It's that direct connection, no interneuron involved.
Exactly. So let's think about it from the beginning of the reflex arc.
Okay, like how the muscle spindle is the receptor.
Yeah, and that receptor responds to a specific type of stimuli.
Uh-huh. Like when your muscles are stretched.
Yes, and this information is sent along the sensory neuron.
Okay, which is also called the afferent neuron.
Exactly, carrying information towards the spinal cord.
So it's the incoming information from the muscle.
Yes, and where does it go once it reaches the spinal cord?
That's where the integration center is, right?
Exactly, that is the spinal cord making a decision.
It's like a mini brain without involving our actual brain.
Right, and in the stretch reflex, it's really simple.
Okay, that's because it's monosynaptic. There's no interneuron involved,
Right, so the sensory neuron directly connects to the motor neuron.
which is also called the efferent neuron going out of the spinal cord,
Yes, and that motor neuron goes to what we call the effector.
which is the muscle itself.
Yeah, in this case, the extrafusal fibers that will contract.
Okay, so the whole process is all about maintaining muscle length.
Exactly. If your muscle gets stretched too much or too quickly,
The stretch reflex kicks in to contract the muscle.
to prevent overstretching and potential damage.
Yeah, so that's actually a perfect summarization of how the stretch reflex works, right? If a muscle gets stretched too much or too quickly, that information is sensed by the spindle, it's integrated into the spinal cord, and then the extrafusal contractile muscle fibers surrounding the spindle start to contract, preventing overstretching. Now, that's a great summary of the stretch reflex, but what is the relationship between the stretch reflex and the knee jerk reflex that we all know about?
Okay, it's a great question. It's an important distinction.
Yeah, let's unpack how they're connected.
The knee-jerk reflex is like a special case of the stretch reflex.
Oh, so it builds upon the basic stretch reflex.
Exactly. It starts with a stretch of your quadriceps muscles,
Yeah, like when the doctor hits you with that little hammer,
right? That tap stretches the tendon and then your muscle.
which activates the muscle spindles that are embedded there.
And those spindles send a signal to the spinal cord via sensory neurons.
Okay, so this part is just a normal stretch reflex,
Yes, that's the monosynaptic part where the signal directly goes to a motor neuron.
and then your quadriceps contracts, causing the leg to kick out.
Right, but that's not the whole story of the knee-jerk reflex.
Okay, so that is a great description, but let's talk about reciprocal inhibition. That's really important to the knee jerk reflex.
Absolutely, you're right. Reciprocal inhibition is key here.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's a really important part of the knee jerk.
So remember that inner neuron we just mentioned?
Yeah, the one in the polysynaptic pathway.
Right, instead of stimulating the other muscle to contract.
It actually inhibits the muscle on the opposite side.
Yeah, it's like a reverse signal to the antagonist muscle.
So instead of contracting the muscle, it relaxes it.
Yes, it's like a reverse signal to the antagonist muscle.
That's kind of wild, so it prevents one muscle from contracting.
Yeah, it causes the hamstring muscle to relax.
The one at the back of your thigh.
Right, because that's the antagonist to the quadriceps.
And Dr. Rosario called this reciprocal inhibition.
Exactly, where one muscle contracts and its antagonist relaxes.
Okay, yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for the conversation. We should probably wrap up the podcast right about now.
But before we go, let's try to tie a bow on everything we talked about.
Okay, so we started with intrinsic reflexes, like that flinch reflex.
Yeah, like a survival mechanism from way back.
Then we talked about acquired reflexes, like Kobe Bryant not flinching.
Or even the complex motor learning involved in driving a stick shift.
And then we moved on to the reflex arc and all its parts.
Yeah, like the receptors and the integration center.
And the importance of those muscle spindles.
There's tiny link monitors embedded in our muscles.
Then we talked about the stretch reflex.
Yeah, that monosynaptic pathway.
And that was all leading up to the knee-jerk reflex.
Which is like a special case of the stretch reflex.
Which is all thanks to reciprocal inhibition.
Yeah, that dual mechanism where one muscle contracts and one relaxes.
And that's the secret behind that really powerful kick.
And all of this is mostly happening on autopilot.
Yes, but we can still exert some control over it.
It's this complex interplay between conscious and unconscious movement.
It's why your body shakes when you stretch.
Yeah, that's a warning signal that you may be overdoing it.
It really is a great example of a diagnostic tool as well.
Yeah, like when doctors tap your knee, it's a quick check for nerve damage.
And it highlights how our bodies are constantly adapting.
Yeah, always responding to the environment.
And this all highlights the importance of the muscle spindle.
And its relationship to the stretch and knee-jerk reflexes.
It's a small but super significant component of these systems.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating topic.
So thank you for joining us today on this deep dive.
Yeah, and for all your insightful questions.
We hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for listening.